Okay, so let's unpack this. You flagged something that really, it struck a chord. Started with that image. You know the one?
Which one? The sound wave?
Yeah, the sound wave with the words about the messenger only delivering to a vibrational match.
Oh, right. Don't stress yourself out saying things to people who can't hear you.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Exactly. It clicks, doesn't it? One of those internet things.
It really does. And that whole vibrational match idea, it kind of gets right to the heart of the piece you shared.
The one by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks. The frequency of belonging.
That's the one. It perfectly captures that that frustrating feeling, trying to get something across, and it just doesn't land.
Right, like a fundamental difference in how you're sending or receiving.
Exactly. And this piece really digs into that, particularly around neurodivergence.
Yeah, it's about reclaiming those ways of experiencing the world, right? Connecting, even just surviving, when the world wants you to operate on a different frequency.
And it highlights the harms, the real harms of pathologizing neurodivergence, framing it as a problem.
Instead of just different. And it calls for kinship, like community beyond just what you can do economically.
Absolutely. That's the core thread Hoerricks weaves, exploring how autistic folks might perceive, communicate, remember, contrasting it with the sort of neurotypical standard.
But challenging the idea that it's a deficit. That's key.
Huge. It's presented as a difference, full stop.
So let's dive into that frequency mismatch. The piece talks about communication that's more gestural, metaphorical.
Yeah, and pattern-based, relational. Hoerricks calls it a sensory ecology. It's not necessarily linear, step-by-step logic.
Okay, so not just different styles, but a different way of processing things.
That's the idea. Like, the brain is wired to make sense of the world differently. Think of it like different instruments playing.
Okay.
If one expects a simple melody and gets this rich, complex chord, it feels like a mismatch. You don't quite connect.
And that feeling of not connecting, that sounds incredibly isolating.
It can be. And the piece stresses it's often not about a flaw in logic. It's this mismatch in wavelength.
The receiver just isn't tuned to that frequency.
Precisely. And Hoerricks is really clear. Difference, not deficiency. Neither way is inherently better. It's about recognizing different, valid neurocognitive landscapes.
Neurotypical being this sort of socially standard brain function, neurodivergent being.
Yeah.
Different from that standard, like autism, ADHD.
Exactly. Which brings us to those images we see sometimes.
Oh, right, like Temple Grandin's brain scan, showing the larger visual processing area.
Yeah, that one. And there are posts online, too, about autistic brains maybe having, like, significantly more synapses, those brain connections.
Like 50% more, sometimes even more than that, based on some research shared online.
And these images get shared almost like proof.
Yeah, like, see, it's real. My brain is different, which must feel validating.
It can be, absolutely. A tangible sign against feeling dismissed.
But the piece asks this really sharp question. Are we looking at these differences to understand? Or are we looking for ways to erase them?
To prune the signal, as Hoerricks puts it, that's the really critical point.
Because when you hear interpretations like higher synaptic density means inefficiency, or more brain activity is overactivity.
It subtly shifts it from difference to problem, something to be fixed.
Instead of thinking maybe that density, that activity, maybe relates to a really intense, rich inner world.
Exactly. Why is there this constant need to prove it biologically anyway?
Yeah, why should someone's worth depend on showing these, like, exceptional brain scans?
What if none of that was needed? What if the experience itself, the perception, the feeling, the connection was just enough? Why hinge value on exceptionality?
That really lands, especially when the piece talks about the dangers of trying to fix these differences.
Right, like with the synaptic pruning studies?
Pruning being the brain's natural way of trimming extra connections as we grow up.
Yes. And the finding that autistic brains might prune less gets framed as, oh, we need to correct that.
And Hoerricks traces this worrying path.
Mm-hmm.
Difference becomes deviation, then deficit, then a target for intervention.
Yeah, like drugs to force pruning or certain therapies. There's this real fear based on past harms of normalization of repeating those cycles.
Because that pressure to mask, to hide autistic traits, it wasn't helpful. It was erasure.
It really was. But Hoerricks offers this counter perspective, which I find fascinating.
What's that?
What if that refusal to prune, keeping more connections, isn't a flaw? What if it's protective, generative?
Like it contributes to something valuable.
Maybe. Linked to sensing the world more vividly, maybe holding on to more nuance, contributing to myth, metaphor, that deeper resonance of meaning.
Okay, wow. That connects to the adaptive memory idea, doesn't it?
It does. The piece mentions Reiser's solitary forager hypothesis.
Which suggests these traits might be ancient adaptations, helpful for early human groups.
Exactly. It's a really interesting lens. It proposes that individuals who were maybe pattern-focused preferred quiet, were super attuned to sensory details.
Yeah.
They might have been vital.
How so?
Well, maybe they were the ones who could spot subtle changes in the environment, track game effectively, remember crucial details others missed. The observers, the keepers of knowledge.
So those sensory sensitivities, often seen as a modern problem, could have been like finely tuned instruments back then, tools of precision.
Potentially. And maybe those more gestural relational ways of communicating were the very roots of storytelling, of ritual.
So Hoerricks argues these ways of being aren't mistakes, they're inheritance.
Yeah, traits that stuck around because they served a purpose, they worked.
Which makes you question the whole idea of making these differences smaller or easier, like you said, easier for whom? To what end?
Because trying to prune that isn't therapy, it's losing something valuable, losing ways of knowing.
So the piece positions autistic people not as like a recent thing or outliers, but as holding a kind of memory.
A memory of other ways to be, holding resilience, pattern service.
That really flips the script on the usual narrative.
It does, and it challenges that narrative that ties worth so tightly to, economic output.
Right, the critique of how someone like Temple Grandin is often framed. It's less about honoring her unique insights and more about celebrating her productivity within the current system.
Yes. It highlights this conditional belonging. You can belong if you're productive, if you mask, if you translate your way of being into something economically useful.
But what about people who can't do that? Or choose not to? People who don't fit the mold, who don't mask, who live outside those capitalist norms.
And the piece points out these subtle, sometimes not so subtle, forms of extraction.
Like steering autistic kids towards useful jobs.
Yeah.
Or charities that focus on autism, but maybe not autistic people directly.
Or the intense scrutiny often placed on disabled lives versus, say, unearned wealth. It hammers home that autistic life has inherent value, period, not conditional on output.
Which leads right into the call for kinship, doesn't it?
It does. Beneath that pressure to be special or exceptional, Hoerricks identifies this deep ache.
What kind of ache?
A longing, really, to just be held, met, loved for who you are, without having to constantly prove yourself.
Yeah. And the limits of things like the double empathy problem are mentioned too, right?
Right. While it's useful for understanding mutual communication challenges, the piece notes the burden often falls on the autistic person to do the translating, the bridging.
So the desire is for connection without spectacle, intimacy without evaluation.
Exactly. Love based on being, not on being useful, which
Yep.
contrasts sharply with some media portrayals, maybe like certain reality shows that can feel performative.
Like putting vulnerability on display for a neurotypical audience.
Something like that. Hoerricks imagines a culture where neurodivergent people just are, where presence is participation, where kinship is measured by how well we hold each other.
That focus on interdependence, on care.
It's a powerful vision, recognizing that diverse needs can actually make our collective capacity for care stronger, richer.
So the real need isn't affirmation through exceptionalism.
No, it's kinship that doesn't demand you change who you fundamentally are.
That really resonates. The conclusion sums it up so powerfully.
We do not need to be pruned. Just that direct statement.
Yeah. Emphasizing that these ways of being are ancient, vital, a legacy in memory, evolutionary, sensory, ancestral.
Autistic people aren't new, not broken, not alone. And there's this act of reclaiming happening now.
Reclaiming those neurodivergent ways of knowing and connecting.
Yes. Gesture, metaphor, silence, stimming, solitude, emotional truth, nonlinear language. All of it.
Reclaiming themselves from productivity metrics, from developmental checklists.
And in doing that, reclaiming each other, finding kinship, defiance, care.
That final image.
Yeah.
The solitary forager in the clearing. Vigilant, rooted, holding the map.
It's not about isolation, it's about presence, a vital signal, a promise.
And the acknowledgement that, yeah, maybe not everyone will get it immediately.
But some will, and there's this sense that this way of being was meant to be preserved.
Yeah.
For the future.
So the key takeaway is pretty clear then. Autistic difference isn't disorder.
Not at all. It's a valuable, ancient way of being, deserving understanding, acceptance, not erasure.
It definitely gives you a lot to think about. How these ideas might reshape your own views on neurodiversity, communication.
Absolutely. How we all connect, or sometimes misconnecting.
And maybe here's a final thought to chew on. What if embracing all these different frequencies isn't just about being inclusive?
What if it's more than that?
What if it actually unlocks richer, deeper ways for all of us to understand the world and understand each other?